As an introduction to this episode of God Unites, I would like to read a short excerpt from the About page of the Tolerance Means Dialogue website. We too often find tolerance in short supply at the intersection of faith and other important societal values like non-discrimination and child welfare. In a winner-takes-all mentality, the rights of some are pitted against the rights of others. What gets lost? Mutual respect, justice, and how all people need to be able to live with dignity. It can take courage to engage someone you may disagree with. But these are the most important conversations today. We have three choices. We can continue to avoid them and remain in our echo chambers. We can shout each other down, convinced we're right. Or we can approach each other with a spirit of humility, believing that we can grow together toward a better future. End of quote. The Tolerance Means Dialogue program discussed in this episode is a working example of how University of Illinois students take the lead in showing us a way to achieve that end, an outcome in which mutual respect and a willingness to listen can lead to a sometimes surprising spirit of harmony among diverse groups of participants, without compromising their individual identities, values, or their diversity, and how many, in fact, come away with wisdom the world and our communities could use more of. This is God Unites, finding spiritual unity in religious diversity. Welcome to God Unites. I'm your host, David Risley. And with me today, as a continuing guest, following up with our last episode, is Professor Robin Fretwell Wilson, a law professor at the University of Illinois. Welcome, Professor Wilson.
Thank you, David.
Also joining us today, remotely, is a student at the University of Illinois, Toby George, who is a participant in a program that Professor Wilson will introduce and discuss with us today. Toby, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on here.
Professor Wilson, for the benefit of those who did not hear part one of our conversation, just to encapsulate that, the topic was the intersection between freedom of religion and other human rights, public interests, including non-discrimination. And then in the course of that conversation, in talking about the importance of finding ways to harmonize those sometimes competing interests so that I hesitate to call it a win-win, but it's something where it's not a lose-lose outcome. I mean, things come together in ways that are mutually agreeable. And doing that in a manner that avoids the win-lose paradigm of legal judicial resolution of a lawsuit or something of that sort, or the political dynamic in which there's winners and losers. And that's not a very good way to achieve social stability or social harmony. And it is something that, speaking myself, from a spiritual perspective, it's not in harmony with God's way, which is to bring his children together, not to have them fighting with each other, and some people winning and some people losing. So in the spirit of God Unites, we wanted to have a conversation about how, whether you view it from a religious perspective or a secular perspective, how do we achieve this unity of spirit that is something that everyone can walk away feeling good about? And we talked about principles. Now, today, I'd like to talk about how do we achieve this in practice? And you had brought up a program I can't remember right now whether it was recorded as part of the conversation or whether it was after we stopped recording. You were telling me about a program in which you're involved called Tolerance Means Dialogue. And we want to get into that. But before doing that, we've had a significant development on the legal front, which was yesterday. The Senate passed a negotiated version of the Respect for Marriage Act. And that's now going to go to the House, and it's expected to be passed. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think yesterday we witnessed something we don't always see, which is people crossing the aisle and coming together and, visioning a common sense way forward. Many people, after the abortion decision this summer, in which there was a concurrence by Justice Thomas, raising the prospect of possibly backwalking same-sex marriage and the court's decisions, question whether they could, but he raises the specter of that, and that caused a lot of fear among people about their marriages. Many people who are married in same-sex relations, they want the same thing that other married people want, which is, to know that their relationship is recognized by others, that it'll be there for them in a time of great distress, that the law supports them in that and supports their children. We often believe that marriage is good for the adults and good for children, and same-sex couples wanted the same thing and received that in 2015. On the other side, there were a lot of people also afraid, and you say, how do we find these common sense bridges to each other? And I think it's by finding our common fears and our common interests. And the fear on the other side is people who have a view of marriage that it's between a man and a woman don't always feel safe being able to say that. They worry about anti-discrimination law, which is there to make sure that, LGBT persons, women, people of color, people of a different national origin, that they have a fair shot at jobs and a place to live, and the ability to walk into public places like restaurants and be served. So in that body of law sometimes is the possibility that it could be used in a way that traditional believers feel that they suddenly are on their back heels and excluded. What you see in the Respect for Marriage Act is both sets of hopes and both sets of fears being tied together and married, not to make a pun, but married to each other in a way that, you had more than, we had 61 votes for out of a Senate that's divided.
From a freedom of religion standpoint, people didn't want to be mandated by law to do something to which they held a sincere, deeply held religious belief they should not do, and put in this trick bag of giving up a profession or a license or something of that sort in order to be true to their beliefs and to their sense of what is morally right or wrong. And one of the things that we talked about in our previous episode was a process that you were involved in, actually, in the state of Utah, which resulted in what is sometimes called the Utah Compromise, but which some of the participants prefer to call the Utah Collaboration, which was dealt with many of the same issues. And as a result of good faith negotiations, which took place over some time, and as I understand it, sometimes there were some candid, tense discussions, but they were discussions. There was a dialogue. And as a result of that, the various interests came together in a solution, a legislative solution that passed in Utah and was something that is still something of a model and that the participants still feel on all sides fairly proud of. I know some of the same people that were involved in that were also involved in the negotiations leading to the current form of the Respect for Marriage Act, and I know there are some people who were surprised when my church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, issued an official statement of support for passage of that act. Many of the same elements and processes were involved in the two, although they're not identical. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, they're surprisingly similar in some places. I mean, the text of the language about freedom of religion and belief, is ripped straight from the Utah Compromise, ripped straight from, state laws that, the 10 states in the District of Columbia that voluntarily embraced same-sex marriage before Obergefell. They had similar devices, and these are devices that take the temperature down, take the heat out of a debate, and allow people dispassionately to see if they can live together moving forward. So I think you did see a similar process. You saw a lot of the same people at the table trying to lift this up and make it work. And you saw some of the same people who were critics of the Utah Compromise and would say that, it's a Mormon exceptionalism. It'll never happen again. And yet the groups that came together to help with the Respect for Marriage Act, run the gamut of religious groups, from, the Orthodox Union, which is a Jewish group, to the National Association of Evangelicals is there in the room, the Latter-day Saints, obviously. It's a wide spectrum of religious believers together with gay rights advocates. And I think, the more we see of people breaking bread and taking time to understand each other and reframing the way they sit at that table together, that the claim and the question at the table shouldn't just be, how do I protect myself? But what can I give you that protects you? It's a fundamental reframing.
And Professor Wilson, that's a perfect segue into the practical application of the process that you're describing in the form of the Tolerance Means Dialogue program. Would you introduce that? And then, Toby, we're going to turn to you as a participant in that, a student participant, a key participant, to talk about your experience with that. But first, Professor Wilson, tell us about the Tolerance Means Dialogue program. And by the way, before you do that, so I don't forget it, anyone who wants to learn more about the program can go to its website, which is tolerancemeans, all one word, tolerancemeans.com, tolerancemeans.com. So, Professor Wilson, tell us about it.
Well, after the Utah Compromise, it seemed like progress stalled. And it's a hard lift because our political process is so partisan that lots of people in this space respond to one set of people on one edge of a debate, and it's another set of people who respond to, another set of people over here on this other edge. And it feels like there's many, many, many people who don't think the edges are right, but, aren't a natural constituency. And it dawned on me that we do have, in fact, an army of people who believe that good faith efforts can be made to live together and to stop acting like we're two tribes, start acting like one people again. And the most open-minded of these are our students. They are, in fact, Generation Z and millennials who've grown up with unprecedented diversity in their lives. Their friend sets are, run the gamut of, in every demographic way. They don't necessarily parse off into groups that are homogenous. And so I was fascinated by understanding what is it that they're doing in their relationships that allow them to respect each other completely without giving up on who they are. But they're doing something, David. And what I want to do is understand that, bottle it, ship it around America, and maybe we have a hope. And the essays, if you go to tolerancemeans.com, and thank you for the shout out, are some of the most moving things I've ever read. I mean, there are people who are challenging the suppositions that they grew up with, and they're not very old. It's sort of very much out of the mouths of babes come these wise statements type thing. But, the youngest among us, tomorrow's leaders, I think really get it, and we can learn from them.
Just to underscore the importance of something that's implicit in what you're saying, as I think about being a lawyer and having been involved in government and the administration of government in the state of Illinois as a policy advisor in the former governor's office, there is a dynamic in which, in the legal realm, you have a plaintiff and a defendant, or plural of each, and they fight it out, and somebody wins, somebody loses, unless there's some sort of negotiated settlement, which often happens. But when it doesn't, it's inherently a competitive and oftentimes very contentious process. The political realm, and particularly party politics, is again inherently competitive and polarizing. And those two, legal resolution or political resolution of social conflicts, because of their inherent competitive nature and win-lose sort of paradigm, typically, they're not good forums, shall we say, for resolving many of these social issues. There has to be some other way, some other approach. Now, politics used to be described as the art of bringing people together to solve problems for the common good. And it doesn't have to happen in the context of government. I mean, that's something that can happen in outside party competition. But some way of bringing people together to solve problems so it never becomes contentious in the political sense, or in the political sense, it makes it easy to resolve because you have a consensus that is developed. It seems to me that if there is going to come to be this unity that we're talking about here, it probably is not going to be through the legal process. It probably is not going to come about through the political process. It's probably going to be coming about in some other way. And that's what you're talking about. And Toby, cue you. You're a participant in this, in the Tolerance Means Dialogue program. Tell us what that is from your perspective and what your experience with it has been, if you will.
Yeah, as I joined through the Law 199 class, which is made up of university students here at the U of I. And it's all these students who are working together to prop up these dialogues. And my experience has just been, just even interacting with them, it is quite amazing to see how these individuals who are from all different disciplines, want to see a future in which, these debates and arguments don't end up in gridlocks, where there is no common ground. And for me, it's always just astounding just to hear them just speak about their own issues, whether it's something like immigration, to prison reform, to, just even in some of these coffee chats, just hearing their personal story. But, how they work together to prop up the dialogues. Even just the work we do within the dialogues when it comes to reaching out within the community and at the host university itself. The ideas that we end up churning out of, who to reach out to, who to talk to. It's genuinely amazing to see, there is no, prejudice that one may hold against, inviting this group over and to inviting, those professors over, to getting this RSO or registered student organization for coming through and just to participate in these dialogues. It's truly amazing. And recently, a lot of my work has been focusing on sort of analyzing the individuals who come to our events, individuals who submit essays. And it's amazing, it's not just individuals who are interested in the law who are coming to these dialogues. They're quite literally from every single discipline, from those who want to go to med school, those who want to go into journalism, from the technical field of technology. It's quite astounding to see, it's such a diverse mix of leaders, quite literally, as Professor Wilson has stated.
Now, that's interesting to me because the typical model of bringing people together to discuss an issue is a little bit like preaching to the choir. You bring the like-minded, all sit around a table, and they work out something where they're all in harmony and declare unanimity, when in fact, people who with different perspectives or points of view or interests, even rights, human rights, are not at the table. And what you're describing is a process, as I understand it, of deliberately seeking out those who have contrary views and bringing them into, maybe literally around a table, but figuratively bringing them to the table in the form of these dialogues that you're describing. Professor Wilson, will you describe how these dialogues work? What are you talking about when you talk about a dialogue?
Yeah, and Toby's done a great job sort of, helping understand how the students at the University of Illinois have been working on building a tolerant America from a little piece of central Illinois. But basically what we do is we have an essay contest where students compete to write an essay about what we can learn from civil rights about tomorrow, or the essay prompt might be, what does tolerance mean, in today's world? And students write 500-word essays. They compete for 2 tolerance scholarships. One is given to an undergraduate student, and one's given to a graduate student by design. And then we have a dialogue that's based on the same prompt at which the winning essayists present. And so there'll be 2 catalysts that will sort of try to frame topics and, bring it down, should the cake baker have to make the cake, or what are these fights really about? What's at stake? And then when the dialogue catalysts talk, they then turn to the winning essayists and we hear from them. And they, frankly, steal the show every time because, the students that gather in those rooms, and they are incredibly diverse. I mean, every sort of thread in the fabric of a university is there in the room, represented. And they're there to cheer on their colleagues who were brave enough to write these essays. And, the essays are very raw and compelling. And, they're deeply incisive. And then we open it up for discussion. And sometimes that's where the really good stuff happens because, it's the people in the room engaging the catalysts and the essay winners about, well, why do you say this? Or how should we think of this problem, in this particular case? And oftentimes the people who come to the dialogues are grappling themselves with their own sort of sense of identity because they're told things like, oh, well, if you are socially conservative, then, you can't be pro-LGBT, a student said at one of our dialogues. Or I can't be for Medicare for all if I'm a Republican, but I think everybody needs help. How should I think about this? That's the really interesting stuff. And it happens in the moment. A nice thing about the dialogues is that we have a social media engagement prize so that anybody in the room can tweet a question to a particular hashtag and it'll get pulled out and fed into the dialogue. So if you are in Ireland, as people have, streamed in, a whole nother country, or, in the next building, or you're in the room and just don't feel comfortable enough to ask your question. Because these are hard times, people feel canceled. They feel at risk for speaking sometimes. But we spend an awful lot of energy trying to tenor, the idea that every view is a respectable view, and we want to engage them. And I think we've been very successful at that.
Toby, you've participated, you've observed, and I'd be interested in hearing about your observations and your experiences of not just the diversity of the participants, but what happens in the process of this interesting approach to bringing out the differences, giving people an opportunity to share their perspectives and hearing different perspectives. And I didn't know about the international potential for this, so even people virtually joining that. What are your observations about how this has worked? What's been your experience personally?
It's interesting kind of seeing how these conversations come about. And it's always posed by a question. And I've noticed how much curiosity and the willingness to learn about an issue is kind of at the center for a lot of these things. If you approach, or at least I've noticed that if you approach it from such a point or perspective where you're unwilling to learn or unwilling to find that common ground, it's going to be difficult to find that under common ground. But if you're willing to approach it in terms of understanding what the other person is saying, what they're trying to get at, essentially recognizing that their point is also valid. There's reasons why they believe it. And it's something that I kind of noticed in some of these, I've been able to join these dialogues through Zoom primarily. And just seeing the chat and seeing how people approach it and seeing like, oh, that's a different way to think about it issue, It's definitely different than some of the debates we see on TV, where you're seeing people who take two very different, stances and approach it thinking that they're right. But even just like these Zoom chats, I'm seeing how these students and these leaders are approaching it from curiosity and from wanting to learn it and wanting to see what the other person is saying. And I think it's a really big thing that I've noticed on my end. And I've even seen just in the essays themselves as well. It's just that you have to approach it with this open-mindedness. And it's like once you do that and you set yourself in that perspective, the essay is incredibly compelling and you're kind of just blown away because you're just like, you never really realized that. But yeah, that's just sort of like what I've realized and something that I've embraced, especially when it comes to just everyday life in general.
You've raised three important points that I'd like to highlight, more than three, but I'd like to highlight three of them. One of them, you mentioned common ground. Now, if there's going to be unity, it usually is unity on common ground. And it seems to me you're describing a process by which people discover more common ground than they expected there would be at the beginning of the process, as they come to understand the interests of people that they may have viewed previously as being opponents, but they find that their interests, or at least some of their interests, are areas in which they can stand together, united. Like, for example, respect for human dignity, which was a topic that Professor Wilson and I talked about in our previous episode and in our personal, private conversations. Now, that's something that people ought to be able to stand united on and then work out from there. You also mentioned the importance of, I'm going to paraphrase it as humility. Instead of viewing oneself, you said you come into this process maybe thinking my position is right and the other person's position is wrong. One of the things in legal mediation that is a principle is interests unite, but positions divide. And, that's often the case. And when somebody finds out something about the other person's position and what the basis for it is, they find, oh, it's based on an interest that I share. And there's a certain humility that's required for that. And it's interesting in a university setting where there is probably more of a willingness for that than maybe society in general. We kind of tend to solidify in our perspectives as we get older. And that's something that needs to be consciously resisted, consciously having the attitude that nobody has the market cornered on being right on things. From a religious perspective, God has a perspective that exceeds anything that we can even imagine, understanding all of the people and interests involved, and we don't even approach that. So if you're a religious person, which would be true of, I think, a lot of those approaching this from a fairly conservative standpoint, inherently there should be some humility in that. But sometimes that's lacking among the people that are involved. And the third thing you said was how this affects just your regular life, your attitude toward life in general. Would you care to comment on that last point?
Yeah. The reason why I said that is because I took a class last semester, and the first thing the professor says is that do not think you're correct in anything. You are stupid at its finest. Approach everything as if you're confused and ask questions always. And I remember in that class, anytime someone tried to raise their hand and say that they're correct about something, whether it's a philosophy that we're learning or some sort of court case, professor would just lay down so much information that proved that they were wrong.
Regardless of the position?
Regardless of the position. It was a very interesting class. It changed a lot, and I realized how prevalent that concept is. And when it came to my everyday life, whether it's figuring out an issue with my roommate, whether it's with my friends, I've realized just taking a step back and just being able to be, understand what's going on, asking questions, being curious, understanding that my position is not always going to be right. It completely changed how I connect with people and how I sort of understand them. And then, even in just other concepts of just in, campus life and registered student organizations, I've noticed how even just approaching it from this perspective, or even in class group projects, you realize how different perspective and the discussions that kind of brings to the table.
Your comments bring two thoughts to mind. First, early on, it reminded me of something my dad related to me. It was actually relating something that an associate of his had shared, which is a professor at the University of Illinois had shared, which is, it's not the things that we don't know that make us ignorant. It's the things we know that just aren't so. And I've always remembered that, it's a message about humility, and it applies to your positions. My position is right, and all of that. But the second thing, I just want to observe, you have gained a wisdom well beyond your years. And if this process that you're talking about, the process of tolerance means dialogue, results in the participants, the observers, gaining such wisdom, then it is something that we should all be learning more about and figuring out how can we apply the lessons learned from this process in essentially a university-based process to social dialogue, resolving social issues and conflicts in both our personal and community and even political spheres. Professor Wilson, I'm going to turn to you. Our time, I know both of you need to leave, but do you have any concluding comments? And then Toby, I'm going to turn to you.
No, I just want to say how proud I am of Toby, not just Toby, really the whole class. Because, I make him get up at 8 o'clock for meetings. And, they're all there trying to think about, well, how do I, get a student in Long Island, New York, to come to a dialogue, on Constitution Day to learn something. And they're doing some sort of magic. And you can hear it from Toby. It is a kind of wisdom. But they have wildly succeeded in modeling something that we don't often see, which is working at our relationships. And it's a very selfless thing that they're doing. I mean, we'll be doing one of these at the University of Illinois, Chicago, I think on March 18th. But, they're not traveling to Long Island for this. And yet, from a distance, they are the ones who set this amazing thing in motion. I think it's really something to be proud of.
Well, I do too. And Toby, I'm going to give you the last word here. Any concluding thoughts?
I appreciate all the compliments. But genuine, I think it's just being human at the end of the day and being able to see the other person and just having empathy at its center and being curious always. And always learning as well. The Tolerance Means Dialogue and just getting to work with these group of people completely astounds me every day. It makes going to these 8 a.m. meetings worth it because the discussions are just so vibrant and they're just getting to hear these students it just makes it worth it.
Those who are listening and even maybe watching the video portion of it won't have seen this, but as you said, it's all about being human at the end of the day. Professor Wilson and I looked at each other and we're both nodding. That essentially is it. Living human dignity and respect for human dignity. Now, I want to thank you both for participating in this program. The Spirit of God unites. The spirit of contention divides. And whether people look at it from a religious or a secular perspective, we can feel and know the difference. Thank you both for being involved here in this program.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
This is God Unites, finding spiritual unity in religious diversity.